at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and she joins us now via Zoom to talk to us about Africa's place inside the United Nations and any impact the continent needs to come up with to make a meaningful contribution to the organization. And more importantly, debt cancellation calls African leaders are making to rich nations at this session. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Good evening, Peter, and good evening to the viewers.
I suppose when we ask the question about Africa's participation and relevance at the United Nations, maybe it's not fair because a lot of other countries in the world are in the same boat as us. Essentially, if you're not in the Security Council, pretty much you're other.
It speaks to essentially the structure of the global order as we know it, and the very existence of a core and a periphery that is the reality of the neoliberal world order that we are facing. But in arguing about the African cause, it then speaks to the strategy that the Global South is using, this idea of bandwagoning, this idea of getting together into groupings and coalitions in order to increase their leverage and their bargaining position on global bodies. And this is a long and time-tested strategy that has been used in elevating one's position and being able to amplify the voices, speaking as one on the continent. But so also is the aspect of regionalism, which is another important vehicle in not only ensuring that your voice is heard, but also in delivering issues, but also championing your causes on the international arena, and also being able to assert yourself in certain common interests, common agendas, and being able to drive that according to certain parameters. So it can be an issue of, if you come together, then you represent a particular percentage of the population, or you present a particular economic weight, or you present a particular diplomatic presence. So these are some of the strategies that have been employed by the Global South.
Having a rotating seat at the UN Security Council, has that given Africa a bit more voice, or is it just another seat where we don't get much opportunity to influence?
The issue of UN reform has been an enduring one. The debates have been enduring, and like I said, it speaks to the structure of the global order. It is essentially, one can be said as an accommodating strategy, but the extent to which it is sufficient, or the degree to which it is sufficient, is up for debate, particularly if you look at greater calls for UN security reform. And on the other hand, the kind of reluctance that we've seen from the long-established powers, who are very keen to protect not only their veto, but their imprint on the UN Security Council. So that has been a source of friction for decades, and the question of reform is certainly one. It's a very thorny issue. It's one which has evaded not only the policymakers, but also scholars to a large extent. There have been numerous proposals put forward about reform, but it's a question of actually getting broad consensus and traction, and the ability to actually see through and effect wide-scale and wholesale reform. That has been a particular issue till now. But interestingly, when you look at the debate that we've been having, and if you look at the speeches that were made by African leaders in this iteration of the Global Assembly, the UNGA-76, actually the issue of representation of Africa is one that has come up increasingly. It's been referenced by several African leaders. I was listening to speeches like by Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo. I was listening to also speeches by South African President Ramaphosa. And this issue of representation is one that was commonly referenced by these leaders. I found President Akufo-Addo's speech particularly hard-hitting. He actually called for the inclusion of Africa into the G20, so essentially making it a G21, and that would not only enable access. Yes, the meeting would be longer by, let's say, averagely 10 minutes, but that very small token of representation would add so much output legitimacy and input legitimacy to the G20. So he was calling for that, and he was also calling for the creation of, for instance, a Pan-African stability mechanism, one that would also ensure that there's financing and greater financial stability and macroeconomic recovery for African countries. So these are just some of the calls that we've seen, and like I said, it's been a recurrent theme across the decades, the issue of reform and the issue of representation, particularly by Africa.
So I've got grey hair now, and for as long as I can remember, everything that you've said has been said time and time again, year after year. Is it falling on deaf ears, or they're hearing us and just ignoring us?
I think we're having a dialogue of the deaf in this case. It speaks to the real politic in international politics. It speaks to the power dynamics. It speaks to the hierarchy and the very anarchic condition of the global order, that the powerful are very keen on showing up their interests, even if that means sometimes sacrificing the interest of the many. And while on the other hand, so it's almost like a double speak. So on one hand, you call and you champion for equality and multilateralism, but on the other hand, you're very keen to preserve your deck of cards, your levers of power. And it just speaks to the essence of inequality, the fact that we are not all equal. And if one was to borrow the analogy of the animal farm, some animals tend to be more equal than others. And this is what we are seeing certainly playing out at the global and the international scale. So it's a question of then, for us as Africans, we have to find very innovative strategies of navigating that space. Perhaps the question of reform is one, and the question of the UN reform is one that has become increasingly salient. The question of the crisis of multilateralism has become even more relevant when we think about the effect and the compound effects of the pandemic. So these are some of the issues that are even adding and feeding and fueling the debate for reform much more, one would argue much more than before.
How much do we contribute to our own challenges at the UN? Because some would say that there's a number of leaders on our continent that perhaps are in the pockets of some of these leaders.
Yes, it's a question of also those who pay the piper will dictate which tune needs to be played, and that has been the case in terms of limitations of African agency. So you'll see leaders playing to the gallery when it comes to meeting and being summoned to all these high-level summits. In fact, over the decade, we've seen summitry being a key element of diplomacy. Yes, it's important in terms of achieving and ensuring that there's collective action on a number of common challenges, but it ultimately touches on the question of African agency. And some of the speeches that I've had, and increasingly the kind of move that we are seeing, is one where there's a crop of leaders coming out who are very assertive about Africa not being this idea of Africa not being a case of just receiving, being on the receiving end, being a charity case, and being a case for receiving only handouts. So there's a push for African agency, but as you're saying, there's also another group of leaders who are keen on playing to the hand and the agenda of more powerful, even that means sacrificing a bit of their agency and a bit of their leverage to exercise autonomy. So this has been problematic for decades and it speaks to, like I'm saying, very real structural constraints, very real differences and differentiations in power that we're seeing on the global level. So it's on one hand, it's a very interesting game in the broader international politics, whether you want to approach it from a realist perspective or a liberal perspective. It's the question of then if you want to show up your interest, if you want to be taken seriously, then you have to have certain capabilities that will reinforce your position on the global arena and also reinforce your prestige. So this is the task for many of the leaders who not only serve as statesmen but also as foreign policy makers in both roles, I would say.
So how would we explain to children if you're part of a club that doesn't take you seriously, why not just leave and set up your own? How do we explain it to young people why we stay at the United Nations under such conditions, with a grouping that's refusing to reform itself?
You stay on one hand, Peter, because it's a very hyper-connected world. It's a world where there's very complex interdependency. So this whole idea of trying to be a pariah will not work in your long-term interests, particularly because one of the levers of connectivity is the issue of the globalized economy. So just by the very nature that you need to participate in a globalized economy means that in effect you are connected to this forces of globalization. On the other hand, it's the whole question of Westphalian order, the idea that if you want to be recognized and there are certain norms that operate around the Westphalian model. So this idea of sovereignty, this idea of statehood in very specific forms, particularly the model that we are seeing of statehood, where you must also have recognition by your other sovereign peers. And that you must be seen as wanting to cooperate in order to not only get your share of the global public goods, but also being able to have a voice and having mutual respect and effecting change on a global arena. So it's this whole idea of mutual recognition around the sovereignty principle. It's the idea of the globalized economy. You can't just extract yourself without incurring particular not only material costs but also reputational costs to yourself. So this is just some of the levers that you need to be aware of, the factors that you need to be aware of when you say you want to extract yourself. It's not as easy as it seems, particularly on paper. When you look at it in practice, extraction or isolation is certainly a very costly game.
All right, Faith, I wish we could chat a bit longer on this, but I suppose some might say that we need to start at home, actually, to build up the African Union for it to be able to do things, take action and be more assertive, and then we might be able to take on the world. But thank you so much indeed for joining us this evening, and your insights greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Faith Mabera, who's a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, talking to us about Africa's participation at the UNGA-76 that's just played out, and how we need to get more of a voice at such a global gathering.